Hello, fellow FreeBSD nerds. So this is a companion video to my blog post on hacking on FreeBSD with an Apple Silicon MacBook. The reason I decided to make this video is because this process is a little bit involved. It's not too bad, but I know that watching videos is a lot of times much easier than following along on a blog post. The I like my the tagline here. Another FreeBSD hacker with a MacBook. Will it never end? I think this is a common idea in the FreeBSD community that a lot of the FreeBSD hackers have a MacBook. Um, I have an excuse. I worked for Apple for a long time, and I really enjoy the macOS environment. So yeah. So the first thing I did when I went to set up, when I was thinking about how am I going to develop on FreeBSD when I'm at a coffee shop or somewhere coding on my MacBook, and the I think the what I came up with obviously is develop on a VM, and so how do you run a VM on a or Apple Silicon ARM based Mac? And luckily somebody came out this CTSR CT source. Um, Came up with a pretty good guide on how to do it. And so this one specifically talks about running FreeBSD 13.1 on ARM64, but since I've got some code that I want to put into current and see if sooner or later, see if I can get it integrated. And so you can just use a separate image if you want a different image. You don't have to use the 13.1 release image. You can use um, you can use the 15, which isn't a release, but it's current, and I'll show you where that is. So right now, according to the guide, it's pretty straightforward. You have to use Xcode to install, or Xcode select installs to install some of the dependencies for Brew. And then use Brew, install Brew, and then use Brew to install QEMU. And then you can test it by running that command to make sure that you've got the right QEMU running. And this process should work on an Intel-based Mac also, but you'll want to use, instead of the ARM FreeBSD images, you want to use the Intel FreeBSD images, obviously. So if you go down here, so you don't have to do the P flash, and then using DD to essentially, I think it's at the first, yeah, the first 64 meg, 1 megabyte, 64 megabytes of the block. Yeah, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. Yeah, it's definitely not. You can just use BIOS, and that's what I ended up doing. Is just use BIOS, QEMU, EFI FD, and it'll just boot the image. So yeah, so follow along. You don't have to necessarily do that. Just download the EFI BIOS image, untar it, and then run here. I can actually show you what this looks like. So yeah, in the right directory. So yeah, so you download that where the guide tells you to. It um, extracts the QEMU EFI FD, the QEMU vars FD, and you also want to go ahead and go out and download. I prefer I'm developing on FreeBSD 15 current, so you can find that on the FreeBSD website, a link to that. So make sure you download, if you're on Apple Silicon Mac, make sure you're getting the AR64, which is your ARM images, and you can go to latest to get the latest image. And you'll have to extract it because it comes as XV, which is a compression format, and just XZD, and then the name of whatever the name of your file is, and that will extract your file. And then you get the raw image. The the script or the guide tells you how to run your own version. Now, it's a good idea to throw this into a script so that way you don't have to remember the command line and type it out every single time. So I've departed just a little bit from what the guide has you do. Mostly, I don't use a pflash. I just use BIOS, and I've got an actual version of that script. Here we go. And it just tells you what each one of the command line parameters do. So invert, you can see use Vert Machine, Excel, use the macOS hypervisor framework, use the host CPU type, 8 cores, 8 gigs of RAM. Yeah, here's the BIOS. Display, show default, show cursor on. Yeah, USB controller, keyboard, tablet. Not sure that's needed. Intel HD8 audio. That's because I was doing some HDA audio work before. Duplex, and here's your file. So this is the actual the image file that you downloaded from the internet, and you want to use the RAW format. So the .raw files when you want to download. I am using ZFS because some of the code I'm working on the add user script to add so that you can add add user creates a ZFS data set for the user. So I'll probably, in a forthcoming video, I'll work on that code and record it. Just kind of a fun thing to do, just recording videos, programming. I enjoy watching people do that, and so I decided to give it a go myself, but I wanted to talk about the environment that I'm coding in first. And this is a departure from the guide, as I use a VMnet shared network device, which requires root access to the macOS host system, so your MacBook. The easiest way to do this is a pretty easy way to get internet access or to get, excuse me, network access for your host. And that's going to be important in order to use NFS on the MacBook to access your source code that's on the MacBook, because what I wanted to avoid, which is I've programmed this way in the past, and it's kind of a pain because it's the iteration time is just way too long, is by making changes to the code, updating Git, pushing changes to Git, going over to the server where I want to test those changes and pulling those down with Git, test, 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 and then go back to iterate. And that is, when you're in a situation where, it's like can be some mission critical code, or it's or iteration isn't as important. It's fine, but for what I want to do, I want to make change, test, make sure it works, change, test. And in order to do that, I like the environment to exist on the MacBook completely, and be able to run run the code natively on FreeBSD, because I like to hack around on FreeBSD. So you can look here. So NFS. So what I want to do is I want to share the code, the FreeBSD base code on. I want to share that via NFS with the FreeBSD VM. And so with macOS, believe it or not, macOS still has an NFSD server. Now, I don't know if that's the case with Ventura, with Sonoma. Sonoma is the next version of macOS. What I have on my laptop, this is running Ventura. So NFSD is still a thing on Ventura. It still works pretty well. And so it's easy to set up, at least on Ventura. You can edit the exports file. You have to use sudo because it's a root owned file. And this is pretty straightforward. As I say system volumes data should be exported as read-only. All dirs, that particular parameter just means that every directory underneath can be mounted directly. And I'll show you what that looks like. And then this is important. What IP address are you allowing? So this is the allowed IP addresses that can hit the system. So you don't want this to be everybody because you don't want to share it with everybody, obviously. But I don't usually leave NFSD running on my system for at all times because I'm not always coding on it. But generally, when I'm just coding with FreeBSD, I'll turn NFSD on with the NFSD utility. And NFSD utility, which is it kind of breaks the Unix model a little bit. It's not it's the both the daemon and control utilities. So you use it to start stop NFSD to turn it on and off, and this has to do with launchd, all the Apple-y way of managing services. But if you want to get a better look at the exports, you can actually man exports and give you some examples. These are very BSD-ish. This is a very BSD-ish way of doing this, but not. It does not do. The RPC stuff is very different on macOS than what you're used to on FreeBSD. I think show mount still works though. So you want to see what's next? Where is show mount? Yeah. So it'll tell you what's actually exported. So that utility still works. But so if you make an update to your Etsy exports, you just have to NSD or NFSD update. If it's not enabled, which I don't think it is by default, you use sudo NFSD enable. Yeah, that's enabled. Then starting and enabling are different things, but you don't have to. You do if you just start it and not enable it, then it won't turn on the next time you reboot your system. So think about it like with FreeBSD's RC system where you do a one start as opposed to enable. So you can actually, there is a logging system. Let's see, yeah. So Apple's log facility has changed quite a bit over the years. So it's actually more similar to systemd in that, it's stored in a binary format. A lot of logs are stored in binary format, and they have this idea of, well, your searching has the idea of using a predicate. So you can say, I want a process that looks like NFSD, because if you were just to do log stream, it would just go by way too fast. But if you actually said, okay, I want to see all the NFSD stuff, this is great for diagnosing if there's something wrong with your exports, because it'll tell you pretty quick if there's a problem with the exports and what the problem was. So you can see, get export list right here, system volume data, which is where all the user information, user drives are stored. So that's a good way to, so instead of trying to cat more log messages or more log messages, or it's syslogin, system log, which is just, you're gonna get all kinds of crazy stuff that's not going to have anything to do with what you're looking for. If you attempt to try to export or cat or grep the macOS system log. So that's NFSD. So now let's boot our VM. So this is the same script as I showed before. Yep. And it just uses the BIOS QEMU FU, but it has to use sudo because of that network interface. It used to be QEMU use the tap interface on macOS, but macOS, Apple stopped allowing the kernel extensions. And so support was basically dropped for the tap, and I think QEMU went with the VMnet facility as opposed to trying to use tap. And I'm not sure how related they are. I haven't actually gone in to look at the details behind that, but so you can see once you start it up, there we go. All right, FreeBSD is booting. Yay. Oop. So I've got it. I'm pretty sure that's just a, yeah, it's a lock. Yeah, I think this is a lock reversal between the VM or the VTnet driver and the IPv6 driver. So not a big deal. I haven't looked into it too closely, but yeah, so you get your FreeBSD system booted, and so I've already booted this system several times, been working on it, so it's it's got make sure ZFS is up and running. Everything is working as expected. I don't usually put a root password on my development VMs because I blow them away all the time. This is not a system that is up for very long. So do not do not run root without password in production for obvious reasons. And so when I get this far, I am in the VM now, and you see in /root. So I created a little mount script that just mounts NFS or mounts NFS on the host. So by default, QEMU hands the host 192.168.64.1 address. This system should be .2. Yes, so that's why in the Etsy exports, I have allow systems coming from 192.168.64.2 because the client is going to come from that address, and mount. And that mount, what I'm doing is actually mounting inside. So I'm saying mount my home directory or get FreeBSD. I have the FreeBSD base source code in that directory, and um, uh, within the environment, or excuse me, within the VM, I'm mounting it under /user/source because that's where it's expected. So you can see from the git log, that's me doing some work. And it's a little bit slow inside the VM. So, doing git work inside the VM, git work is lots of fiddly little tiny files. So it's easier to do it outside of the VM. NFS can be slow on little tiny files because you have lots of little writes going, back, or writes and reads going little tiny packets back and forth. So, yep, so get FreeBSD, that is I'm working on I'm working on a branch called ZFS add user, which is the ZFS add user I was talking about, adding the add user script, having ZFS awareness. And yeah, so if I jump back over here to VS Code, looking at add user, what I oftentimes do, SSH directly into the VM, and then the user source. Okay, so this is the source code that I am editing now from within the VM on VS Code's terminal. So I can then test changes and test directly as I'm coding here, test down here to make sure what's happening, to make sure that I'm not out of my that I'm going in the proper direction. Okay, so username will say Bob McBob. Nope. That's it's fine. Home. Yep. Nope. See, create ZFS data set. Yes. Nope. List. There you go. Bob McBob has got a directory. Hey, all right, excellent. So that's my process for hacking on FreeBSD from macOS. My name is John Grafton, and I'll post some more videos up just because this is kind of fun, and I'm fairly new to it. I'm still learning OBS. Maybe I'll do it from a FreeBSD my FreeBSD laptop. We'll see. But catch you all next time. Talk to you later. Bye.